On the morning of June 5, 1942, Japanese dive bombers slammed into the flight decks of USS Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, and Lexington, four hulks that vanished in a blaze of fire, leaving the Pacific sky eerily silent. In the weeks leading up to Midway, the United States Navy had pressed its few carriers forward after the Battle of the Coral Sea, hoping to halt Japan's southward thrust toward Australia. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet on 31 December 1941, believed that a decisive carrier clash could turn the tide. The loss of all four ships shattered that hope in an instant and erased America's naval air power from the Western theater. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The destruction at Midway did more than cripple a fleet. It exposed the fragility of a strategy built on a handful of floating airfields. With no carriers left to project force, the United States faced an impossible choice: gamble a desperate rebuild in the face of an enemy that now commanded the seas, or withdraw and concentrate its limited resources elsewhere. What unfolded over the next 2 years would reshape the balance of power across the Pacific and reverberate through every subsequent decision. The victory at Midway gave Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto a clear path to consolidate his empire. Within weeks, Japanese carrier groups, still intact after their own losses in the Coral Sea, swept toward Hawaii, landing troops on Oahu and securing the islands by early July 1942. The capture of Pearl Harbor denied the United States any foothold in the Central Pacific and provided Japan with a massive logistical hub. From Hawaii, the Imperial Japanese Navy turned southward. By September, amphibious forces had seized Fiji and New Caledonia, cutting off Allied supply lines to Australia. Guam, already under Japanese occupation since December 1941, became a forward staging base for further operations toward the Solomon Islands and the northern coast of New Guinea. The rapid succession of victories shocked both Washington and London. The Axis powers now held an unbroken chain of islands stretching from the Aleutians to the Australian mainland. Yet even as Japan celebrated its sweep, cracks began to appear. The logistical burden of supplying such a vast perimeter strained Japanese shipyards already operating at capacity. Moreover, the United States, though crippled in carrier strength, retained a formidable industrial base on the West Coast and a growing fleet of submarines that would soon begin to gnaw at Japan's merchant marine. Still, for the moment, the Pacific was unmistakably under Japanese control. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced an unprecedented dilemma. The loss of Midway had removed any realistic prospect of retaking the Central Pacific in 1942, and the war in Europe demanded ever greater manpower and materiel. In a secret meeting at the White House on 12 October 1942, Roosevelt authorized a negotiated pullout from the Central Pacific, redirecting ships, aircraft, and troops to support the Allied push in North Africa and Italy. The agreement was presented publicly as a strategic redeployment, but behind closed doors it involved delicate talks with the British government and Australian Prime Minister John Curtin. The United States would retain a minimal presence on Midway Atoll, now an isolated outpost under Japanese siege, but would cease all offensive operations east of the international date line. In exchange, Japan promised to respect American interests in Alaska and the West Coast, a promise that would later prove fragile at best. The withdrawal left Australia exposed. With its northern approaches now within striking distance of Japanese airfields in New Guinea and the Philippines, the Australian government began fortifying the eastern coastline while pleading for more Allied assistance, a request that would go largely unanswered as U.S. forces turned their focus to Europe's battlefronts. By early 1943, the Japanese had established air superiority over the Coral Sea region, limiting any Allied attempt to launch a counter-offensive from Australia. Prime Minister Curtin ordered the construction of an extensive network of anti-aircraft batteries along the Queensland coast and the reinforcement of infantry divisions on the east coast. Yet without carrier support or long-range bombers, Australian forces could only adopt a defensive posture. The Japanese, emboldened by their unchecked expansion, launched sporadic raids on northern ports such as Townsville and Cairns, testing Allied resolve. Each raid was met with fierce resistance from ground-based artillery and the newly formed Royal Australian Air Force squadrons equipped with Curtiss P-40s, aircraft that could not challenge carrier-borne aircraft but could harass low-level bombers. The stalemate created a tense atmosphere across the Pacific. While the United States poured resources into the European theater, the Australian public grew increasingly restless, demanding a more active role in defending their continent. The political pressure would later influence Japan's decision to formalize its dominance through diplomacy rather than endless conquest. By mid-1944, both sides recognized that perpetual conflict across such an immense ocean was unsustainable. Japan, having secured resource-rich territories in the Philippines and New Guinea, faced a looming shortage of raw materials needed to fuel its war machine. Meanwhile, the United States, now heavily invested in the European front, could not afford another costly Pacific campaign. Secret negotiations began in November 1944 aboard the British cruiser HMS Duke of York, anchored off the coast of Ceylon. Representatives from Japan, the United States, Britain, and Australia convened to draft a peace settlement that would cement the new status quo. The resulting Pacific Treaty recognized Japanese hegemony from Hawaii down to the Australian mainland, while guaranteeing American commercial rights in Alaska and the West Coast, as well as unrestricted access for British naval forces to the Indian Ocean. The treaty was ratified on 2 December 1944, exactly 3 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor. It marked a profound shift. Japan transitioned from an aggressive empire to a quasi-legitimate regional power, while the United States accepted a permanent loss of influence in the Central Pacific. The agreement also stipulated that Japan would withdraw its forces from the Australian mainland within 10 years, a clause that would later become a source of contention. With diplomatic legitimacy secured, Japan turned its attention to consolidating control over its newly acquired territories. Shipyards sprang up in the Philippines' Cavite Bay and at the former Dutch East Indies port of Surabaya, expanding capacity to replace wartime losses. The Japanese government instituted a massive resource extraction program across New Guinea, tapping into timber, bauxite, and oil reserves previously untouched. Industrial output surged, but it came at a cost. Forced labor from occupied populations, particularly in the Philippines and Indonesia, was employed on a scale that rivaled the German use of slave labor in Europe. Schools were restructured to teach Japanese language and imperial ideology, while local governance was placed under Japanese civil administrators tasked with integrating the economies into a single wartime command. These policies produced short-term gains. By 1948, Japan's shipbuilding tonnage surpassed that of the United Kingdom, and its steel production approached pre-war American levels. Yet beneath the veneer of prosperity, resistance movements began to coalesce, especially among Filipino nationalists who recalled the brutal occupation of 1941-42. The post-war world quickly polarized along ideological lines. The Soviet Union, alarmed by Japan's expanded reach into Southeast Asia, sought to cultivate anti-Japanese insurgencies in Indochina and Burma. Moscow supplied arms and training to guerrilla groups, hoping to create a buffer against Japanese dominance. Meanwhile, the United States, now a leading member of NATO, focused on nuclear deterrence and rebuilding Europe under the Marshall Plan. The American public remained largely unaware of the ongoing tensions in the Pacific, save for occasional newsreel footage of Japanese warships patrolling the South China Sea. Yet intelligence reports indicated that Soviet agents were infiltrating Japanese-controlled ports, gathering data on ship movements and industrial output. The delicate balance between a nuclear-armed United States, a Soviet Union eager to expand its influence in Asia, and an Imperial Japan holding sway over half the Pacific set the stage for a new kind of Cold War. One fought not with massive conventional fleets, but through espionage, proxy wars, and diplomatic brinkmanship. The question loomed, would Japan's empire endure, or would internal dissent and external pressure finally bring it to its knees? By the early 1950s, Japan had woven a quasi-colonial administration across the Pacific Rim. Schools taught the story of the Great East Asian co-prosperity sphere, while local elites were co-opted into advisory councils that reported directly to Tokyo. Infrastructure projects, railways linking Manila to Jakarta, ports upgraded in Fiji and New Caledonia, facilitated trade within the empire but also tightened Japanese control. Yet the veneer of stability cracked as economic disparities widened. In the Philippines, former guerrilla leaders organized underground networks demanding independence. In Indonesia, nationalist sentiment flared after a series of labor strikes at Japanese-run plantations. Even in Hawaii, now a Japanese naval base, native Hawaiian activists staged protests against cultural suppression. The United States, constrained by its treaty obligations and preoccupied with Europe, could only offer diplomatic rebukes. The British Pacific Fleet, reduced to a symbolic presence, maintained patrols but lacked the capacity to challenge Japan's dominance. As the 1960s dawned, the world watched a fragile empire teeter on the edge, its future hinging on whether Japan could adapt its authoritarian model to a changing global order. The story of this divergent timeline serves as a stark reminder of how a single battle can redirect the currents of history. In our actual past, the resilience of the U.S. carrier force at Midway turned the Pacific tide and set the stage for eventual Allied victory. The alternate path we have traced underscores the precariousness of that moment and invites us to reflect on the delicate interplay of chance, strategy, and human decision-making that shapes our world.